Venezuela is one of the great paradoxes of the modern world. A country believed to hold the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Once among the wealthiest nations in Latin America and, at times, even ranked among the richest in the world today, is more often associated with headlines about economic collapse, runaway inflation, food shortages, and social unrest. What puzzles many people is how a nation with such a glorious past could end up in this situation. How did Venezuela go from being close to the United States to gradually turning away and eventually standing in opposition? And ultimately, what caused the country's fortunes to reverse so dramatically? Few realize that for a very long time, Venezuela was completely unaware that it was sitting on an enormous treasure. Beneath what seemed like ordinary land lay vast oil reserves enough to alter the fate of the entire nation. This situation was not unique. Across the world, there are many regions where people lived for generations without knowing that extraordinary resources lay beneath their feet. It was only when foreign companies, especially those from the United States, arrived and began exploration that Venezuela's oil wealth was truly discovered and developed on an industrial scale. From that moment on, Venezuela's destiny took a sharply different turn. Within just a few years, the oil industry exploded in growth. By the late 1920s, Venezuela had risen to become one of the world's largest oil exporters. Money began pouring in at an astonishing rate. The national budget swelled rapidly, and living standards improved noticeably. This was the period when Venezuela embarked on a path to wealth at breathtaking speed. In truth, this boom was inseparable from the role of the United States. American oil companies brought not only capital, but more importantly advanced technology, expertise, and modern management systems. In the early 20th century, very few countries were capable of extracting oil efficiently without cutting-edge technology. Simply having oil underground was not enough. Without the know-how to extract it effectively, costs remained high, output stayed low, and resources remained locked beneath the surface. As a result, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela at the time was clearly symbiotic. The U.S. gained access to abundant energy supplies and substantial profits, while Venezuela experienced a rapid transformation in its fortunes. Most of the major oil companies operating in Venezuela during this period were either American-owned or heavily influenced by U.S. interests. This further tightened the bond between the two countries. The relationship became especially important during World War II, as global demand for energy surged. Venezuela emerged as a crucial link in the oil supply chain for the Allied powers. Venezuelan oil kept factories running and armies moving, playing a significant role in supporting the logistical strength of the United States and its allies. After the war, the world entered a phase of reconstruction. Energy demand remained high, and once again, Venezuela benefited. Oil prices were strong, production volumes were high, and money continued to flow in without interruption. This was the golden age that many Venezuelans still recall today with deep nostalgia. In the 1950s, Venezuela ranked among the countries with the highest per capita income in the world. The lives of the middle and upper classes were marked by extraordinary luxury. People spent freely, traveled abroad often, and imported goods flooded the market. At the time, popular culture even reflected this newfound wealth through iconic phrases and symbols. Shopping was no longer just about meeting needs, it became a way to display status and prestige. This prosperity extended well into the 1970s. At one point, Venezuela's per capita income was said to surpass that of the United States. Many believed the country had discovered a sustainable path to development, built on what seemed like an endless supply of natural resources. However, this rapid accumulation of wealth also planted the seeds of serious problems to come. When a nation becomes overly dependent on natural resources, especially oil, its economy can easily fall out of balance. This phenomenon has occurred in many parts of the world and is known in economics by a well-known term, Dutch disease. It begins when a country suddenly earns massive amounts of foreign currency from resource exports. As foreign money floods in, the local currency strengthens. At first glance, this seems like a good thing, but the consequences can be extremely damaging. A stronger currency makes domestically produced goods more expensive in the eyes of international buyers. Industries and agricultural sectors unrelated to natural resources gradually lose competitiveness. Exports decline, businesses shrink, and entire sectors weaken. Over time, the economy becomes increasingly dependent on a single source of income. And once that source is disrupted, the entire country is thrown into turmoil. Venezuela followed this path almost exactly. During the years when oil generated enormous profits, other sectors were steadily neglected. Domestic production was never developed in a systematic way. Imports grew rapidly, financed by oil money. Everything seemed fine until a major shock arrived. When global oil prices collapsed sharply, falling from high levels to much lower ones in a short period of time, Venezuela's primary source of income all but vanished. With high extraction costs and expensive infrastructure to maintain, a steep drop in oil prices meant profits disappeared, sometimes turning into outright losses. Meanwhile, other sectors of the economy were no longer strong enough to support the country. Venezuela's economy began spiraling into crisis, setting the stage for a long and turbulent period of instability that followed. When oil prices collapsed sharply, Venezuela found itself in an extremely difficult position. During the years of prosperity that came before, the country had borrowed heavily from abroad. Confident that oil revenues would always be sufficient to service its debts. The mindset at the time was much like that of someone with a high and stable income willing to take on loans to buy a house, a car, and expand spending, all under the assumption that the good times would continue. But when crisis struck and income fell dramatically, those loans once seen as tools for growth quickly turned into an overwhelming burden. At this point, Venezuela still maintained relatively good relations with the United States. There was no intention yet to turn away or confront Washington. On the contrary, the country remained heavily dependent on financial and trade channels linked to the U.S. When Venezuela slipped into a debt crisis, it was forced to seek assistance from international financial institutions. These institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, offered support under familiar conditions. The Venezuelan government was required to tighten spending, cut social subsidies, reduce state intervention in the economy, and further open its markets. In theory, these measures were designed to restore fiscal balance and stabilize the macroeconomy. In reality, however, their impact on ordinary people was severe. Funding for healthcare, education, and social welfare was slashed. Prices of essential goods rose sharply, while incomes failed to keep pace. More critically, because domestic production had already weakened over the years, Venezuela was forced to import a wide range of goods including food, medicine, and basic consumer products. Most of these imports came from Western partners, including the United States. As a result, public dissatisfaction spread rapidly. Many Venezuelans began to feel that their country was trapped in a vicious cycle. Oil was sold to earn foreign currency. That currency was used to import goods, and then the same money was used to repay debt. In the end, ordinary people saw little tangible benefit, while daily life grew increasingly difficult. What had once been seen as an important partnership with the United States was now viewed by many as a source of dependency and decline. Public anger reached a breaking point in the late 1980s. Mass protests against austerity policies erupted across the country and quickly escalated into riots in several major cities. Prolonged social unrest further weakened an already fragile economy. In this environment, Venezuela's financial system could not hold. By the mid-1990s, a large portion of the country's banks had fallen into crisis or collapsed entirely. Unemployment surged and living standards plummeted. It was during this period of chaos that a new political movement began to take shape. Many citizens lost faith in the old model and no longer believed that following Western prescriptions would lead to recovery. They began searching for a different path, one that was more forceful, more decisive, and openly confrontational. As a result, politicians with anti-U.S. rhetoric and who rejected the existing economic order began gaining widespread support. By the late 1990s, a leader with a confrontational stance toward the United States won the presidential election and took office. He promised to reclaim control over national resources, redistribute wealth to the poor, and end Venezuela's dependence on foreign powers. Coincidentally, his rise to power came just as global oil prices began to recover and surge upward. Oil revenues once again flowed in abundance. Government finances improved, and social welfare programs expanded. To many citizens, this seemed like proof that the new direction was the right one. They experienced a noticeable improvement in living conditions compared to the previous crisis, and came to believe that a tough stance toward the United States had delivered results. Anti-American sentiment, therefore, grew stronger and more widespread. The Venezuelan government also moved more aggressively to assert control over the oil industry, limit the role of foreign companies, and prioritize partnerships with non-Western countries. Relations between Venezuela and the United States deteriorated rapidly. By the early 2000s, tensions escalated amid allegations of efforts to change the Venezuelan government. Although these events remain controversial to this day, what followed was clear. The Venezuelan leadership hardened its confrontational stance even further. Military and economic cooperation with the U.S. was gradually reduced. Restrictions and sanctions began to emerge, particularly in the defense sector. Cut off from traditional Western suppliers, Venezuela was forced to seek new partners. It turned to other countries for arms, technology, and cooperation. However, these shifts did little to address the core problems of the economy. Venezuela remained almost entirely dependent on oil. Domestic industries stayed weak. Management inefficiencies persisted, and uncontrolled government spending continued. Then, once again, history repeated itself. After the global financial crisis, oil prices fell sharply. Venezuela's primary source of revenue evaporated in a short period of time. This time, the situation was even more severe. The country was more economically isolated than before, and its financial reserves were no longer sufficient to absorb the shock. Inflation soared, the currency rapidly lost value, goods became scarce, and daily life plunged into a deep crisis. Political conflict intensified as well. Opposition groups repeatedly accused the government of electoral fraud and mismanagement, while the ruling authorities insisted they still had the support of the majority. The United States and several other countries openly criticized and refused to recognize election results, further escalating tensions. Venezuela sank into a prolonged state of instability, caught between economic collapse and deep political division. Looking back at the entire story, it becomes clear that Venezuela's prosperity and poverty have been tied to oil prices more closely than to any other factor. When oil prices were high, the country appeared wealthy and generous. When prices fell, every structural weakness in the economy was immediately exposed. The failure to diversify the economy and build strong industrial and agricultural sectors left Venezuela extremely vulnerable to external shocks. There is much room for debate about the roles played by the United States, international institutions, or political decisions at different stages. But at its core, the deepest cause lies in how the country managed and failed to manage its resource wealth. Had Venezuela, during its golden years, accumulated sufficient reserves and invested seriously in production, education, and infrastructure, the oil price shocks might not have devastated the country so thoroughly. For this reason, Venezuela's story is often cited as a costly lesson about resource dependence, the price of failing to prepare for the inevitable volatility of the global economy.